There was once a young girl named Ojugo who lived in a small village called Oboji. This village, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, was a peaceful place where everyone knew each other's name. The air was always fragrant with the scent of roasting corn, the sound of children playing under the heat of the afternoon sun, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoing through the village. But Ojugo was different from the other children. Ojugo had been abandoned at the doorstep of the village orphanage when she was just a baby. Her eyes had never opened to the light of the world, and her ears could only hear the world that existed beyond her reach. She was blind, and her only companion was the wind that whispered secrets to her, the trees that swayed with tails, and the dogs that followed her, barking whenever she cried. The villagers said that Ojugo had a special connection to the spirit world, that her blindness was not just a misfortune, but a blessing, or a curse, depending on who you asked. The orphanage was a large building at the edge of the village, made from dried mud and thatch. It was home to children who, like Ojugo, had nowhere to go. Some had lost their parents, others were orphaned by the ways of the world, disease, poverty, or war. The matron, a stern woman named Nana, ran the orphanage. She was a woman of few words, and even fewer smiles, and her heart was as hardened as the walls of the orphanage she managed. Ojugo spent her days in the quietest part of the orphanage, always alone. The other children, though they didn't speak much to her, whispered behind her back, calling her the girl who talks to dogs, or the cursed one. Ojugo had learned to ignore them. In the stillness of her world, she found solace in the dogs that would always appear at the gates whenever she cried. They barked, howled, and circled the orphanage as though they were protecting her. But no one understood why they came, and so Ojugo was always the subject of whispers and stares. One day, something changed. A couple, Mr. and Mrs. Obodo, came to visit the orphanage. They had been married for many years, but had no children of their own. The villagers spoke of them often, how they were wealthy, kind, and generous. They had made the journey to the orphanage to give gifts to the children, to show their love and appreciation for the village. When they arrived, the matron instructed the children to put on their finest clothes. The brightest and most charming children were placed in front of the visitors, while Ojugo was told to stay in her room. "Your presence will scare the guests," Matron Nana told her with a sharp glance. "Stay out of the way." Ojugo, as she always did, obeyed without protest. She sat in her room, her fingers tracing the smooth texture of her old clothes. In the stillness, she began to sing softly, her voice like the breeze that passed through the trees. It was a song of longing, of love unspoken, of a world she could never see but felt in her heart. She sang not for anyone, but for herself. Outside, Mr. and Mrs. Obodo stood in the courtyard, listening to the soft melody that carried through the walls of the orphanage. "What is that sound?" Mrs. Obodo asked, turning to her husband. Mr. Obodo paused, his brow furrowing as he listened. "It's beautiful," he said. They asked the matron where the sound was coming from. "Oh, that's just one of the older children," she replied quickly. "She's blind, you see, and tends to keep to herself. She's not quite like the others." But the couple wasn't listening. They were already following the sound of Ojugo's voice. As they neared her room, the matron scrambled to stop them. "She's not suitable for visitors," she insisted. "You don't want to go in there. She's caused nothing but trouble. You don't want to see her." But it was too late. Mr. Obodo, a man whose heart was as big as his fortune, gently pushed open the door. There, sitting on the floor, Ojugo sang as though the world around her had faded away. Her head tilted back slightly, her face calm as her voice filled the room. For a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. The Obodo stood in awe. "What's your name, child?" Mr. Obodo asked, kneeling before her. His voice was warm, and Ojugo felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Ojugo," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "Disturb?" Mrs. Obodo whispered, her hand to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." "Would you mind singing for us again?" Mr. Obodo asked. Ojugo hesitated for a moment, but something in their voices made her feel safe. She nodded and began to sing once more. The song was filled with the pain that spoke of loneliness, of longing for a family. The Obodos listened, their hearts open, and for the first time in her life, Ojugo felt as though someone truly saw her. "We want to adopt her," Mr. Obodo declared, standing. "She belongs with us." The matron's eyes widened in shock. "Adopt her?" she gasped. "You can't be serious. There are so many other children here. Healthy, well-behaved children. She is extraordinary," Mrs. Obodo interjected, her voice firm. "If you fail to see that, then it's your loss." The matron was silent. She knew she had lost. Within days, the paperwork was signed. Ojugo was leaving the orphanage, leaving behind the whispers, the harsh words, the loneliness. But as she sat in the back of the Obodos car, her heart was filled with both joy and fear. What would her life be like now? Would it be better, or would she find the same emptiness? The mansion of the Obodos was grand, built on the edge of the village, surrounded by lush gardens and tall gates. Ojugo, blind as she was, could feel the warmth of the house. She could hear the servants moving about, the soft rustle of fabric as Mrs. Obodo led her inside. "This is your home now," Mrs. Obodo said gently. "You are part of our family." But there was one who didn't welcome Ojugo, the Obodo's daughter, Amara. Amara was 18, beautiful and proud, used to being the center of attention. She didn't understand why her parents had chosen to adopt a blind girl, someone who couldn't even see the gifts her family had to offer. Amara's jealousy soon turned into resentment. She began to resent Ojugo, to dislike her very presence. And with the encouragement of her friend Kim, Amara began to make life difficult for Ojugo, causing trouble wherever she could. One evening, Amara poured oil on the floor where Ojugo usually walked, and when Ojugo slipped, hitting her head on the stone floor, Amara was pleased. She laughed as Ojugo lay on the ground, helpless. "She's always in the way," Amara sneered to Kim, "and now I'll make sure she never stays here." Things worsened when Amara framed Ojugo for attacking her with a knife. She planted the knife under Ojugo's pillow, cut herself lightly, and accused Ojugo of trying to kill her. When Mrs. Obodo found the knife, it seemed to confirm Amara's story. Mr. Obodo, horrified, demanded that Ojugo leave. "You're a danger to us all," he said, as Ojugo pleaded, her blind eyes wide with confusion. But as Ojugo was taken back to the orphanage, something extraordinary happened. The dogs, which had always appeared when she was in pain, gathered once again. This time, they surrounded her, their presence somehow comforting. And then, something changed. Ojugo's sight, which had been stolen from her by a curse placed on her mother, suddenly returned. She could see. She saw the faces of the villagers, the trees, the sky. And as she looked into the eyes of the matron, who was now blind, she understood everything. The matron confessed to the curse, to the jealousy she had felt for Ojugo's mother, Adobe. Adobe had been the daughter of a wealthy chief, and when the matron betrayed her, Adobe was cursed to live as a dog, never able to reveal her true identity. But with Ojugo's strength and the love she had found, the curse was broken. Ojugo's mother, transformed back into human form, embraced her daughter, and together They returned to the home that had always been hers, the mansion that the Obodos had stolen from her family. The Obodos, in shame, were forced to leave. Ojugo, her mother Adobe, and their trusted maid Yu began anew. And as they rebuilt their lives, Ojugo knew that she had found a true family. Not one that would judge her by her blindness or her past, but one that saw her for who she truly was, a girl with a heart full of love and the power to break even the strongest curses. The village of Oboji would always remember the girl who was once blind and how she had become a beacon of hope for all. It was a reminder that true love, kindness, and family are the greatest treasures, ones that no curse could ever break.